The moment I stepped through the front door, my heart sank. There stood Edna, my mother-in-law, with her suitcases packed and a smug look on her face. I knew this day would come, but I never expected it to be so soon. "Naomi, your worthless existence is over. Neil doesn't need a useless wife who claims to work. From now on, I'll take care of my son," Edna declared, her voice dripping with disdain. I felt the anger rising within me. "This is my home too, and I work hard every day, Edna. You can't just—" She cut me off, thrusting a stack of papers into my hands. "Don't lie. Sign these papers and leave while I make this place worthy of my family." My eyes widened as I realized what I was holding. Divorce papers, supposedly signed by Neil. The betrayal stung like 1,000 needles, piercing my heart. How could he do this to me after all these years? I looked up at Edna, her eyes gleaming with triumph. She had always resented me, viewing me as an obstacle to her son's success. Now she had finally found a way to get rid of me. But I refused to let her see me crumble. With a steady hand, I signed the papers, my signature a declaration of my resolve. I would not let this defeat me. I would start anew, free from the toxicity that had plagued my life for far too long. As I gathered my belongings, memories of happier times flooded my mind. Neil and I had once been so in love, supporting each other's dreams and ambitions. He had encouraged my freelance writing career, and I had been his rock as he pursued his own passions. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. Neil's writing career stagnated, and he began to indulge his parents' delusions of grandeur. The loving husband I once knew had become a stranger, a mere puppet in his family's twisted play. I pushed the memories aside, focusing on the present. I had to find a new place to live, to rebuild my life on my own terms. It wouldn't be easy, but I knew I had the strength within me to overcome this challenge. As I stepped out of the house, I caught a glimpse of Edna's smug smile. She thought she had won, but little did she know that this was just the beginning of my journey. I would prove to her, to Neil, and to myself that I was more than just a useless wife. With each step, I felt a newfound sense of purpose. The road ahead was uncertain, but I was ready to face it head-on. I had spent too many years living in the shadows of others' expectations. Now, it was time for me to reclaim my life and find the happiness I deserved. As I walked away from the house that had once been my home, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness. But I knew that this was not the end, but rather the start of a new chapter. A chapter where I would be the author of my own story, free from the chains of the past. With a deep breath, I stepped into the unknown, ready to embrace the challenges and triumphs that lay ahead. This was my time to shine, and nothing, not even Edna's cruelty or Neil's betrayal, could stop me now. As I settled into the driver's seat of my car, the weight of the past few hours crashed down on me. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white as I fought back the tears that threatened to spill. How had it come to this? How had the love Neil and I once shared turned into such a bitter, twisted mess? Memories of our early days together flooded my mind. I remembered the way Neil's eyes sparkled when he talked about his writing, the passion in his voice as he shared his dreams with me. I had been his biggest supporter, encouraging him to pursue his craft while I worked tirelessly to build my own freelance career. We had been a team, a partnership built on love and mutual respect. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. Neil's writing career had stagnated, and he had become increasingly distant, spending more and more time trying to please his parents. I had tried to be understanding, to be supportive, but Edna's constant meddling and Neil's growing resentment had taken their toll. The once loving husband I knew had become a stranger, a shell of the man I had fallen in love with. As I drove through the familiar streets of our neighborhood, I couldn't help but wonder what had gone wrong. Had I not been enough? Had I not loved him enough, supported him enough? But deep down, I knew the truth. It wasn't about me. It was about Neil's inability to stand up to his parents, to assert himself, and fight for our marriage. He had chosen to indulge their delusions, to prioritize their expectations over our relationship. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I had to move on, to find a new place to live and start over. I couldn't continue to live in a house where I was constantly belittled and undermined, where my own husband had betrayed me so deeply. I pulled into the parking lot of a local coffee shop, needing a moment to gather my thoughts. As I sat there, sipping on a steaming cup of coffee, I felt a newfound sense of determination wash over me. I would not let this defeat me. I would rise above the pain and the betrayal, and I would build a new life for myself. I pulled out my phone and started searching for apartments in the area. It wouldn't be easy, starting over at my age, but I knew I had the strength within me to do it. I had spent too many years living in the shadows of others' expectations. It was time for me to step into the light and reclaim my life. As I scrolled through the listings, a sense of excitement began to build within me. This was my chance to start fresh, to create a home that was truly my own. A place where I could be myself, free from the constant judgment and criticism of my in-laws. I knew there would be challenges ahead. I would have to face the reality of Neil's betrayal and the disdain of his family. But I was ready. I had spent too many years silently enduring their abuse, and I refused to do it any longer. With a newfound sense of purpose, I finished my coffee and headed back to the car. I had a lot of work ahead of me, but I was ready to face it head on. This was my time to shine, to prove to myself and to the world that I was more than just a useless wife. As I drove away from the coffee shop, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. I was ready to embrace the challenges and triumphs that lay ahead, to write the next chapter of my life on my own terms. The days following my departure from the house I once called home were a whirlwind of emotions. I threw myself into my work, determined to prove to myself and everyone else that I was more than just a useless wife. But even as I poured my heart and soul into my freelance projects, I couldn't escape the constant barrage of insults and passive-aggressive behavior from Edna and Neil. Every family gathering became a battlefield, with Edna taking every opportunity to publicly humiliate me. She would make snide comments about my work, my appearance, and my supposed lack of contribution to the family. Neil, ever the dutiful son, would sit silently by, never once coming to my defense. I remember one particularly painful incident at a family dinner. Edna had invited everyone over to celebrate Neil's supposed writing success, and I had reluctantly agreed to attend. As we sat around the table, Edna began to regale the family with tales of Neil's literary prowess, painting him as a rising star in the publishing world. I knew it was all a lie, but I bit my tongue, not wanting to cause a scene. But Edna wasn't content to simply praise her son. She turned to me, a cruel smile playing on her lips, and said, "And what about you, Naomi? What have you accomplished lately? Still playing at being a writer?" The table fell silent, and I felt all eyes on me. I wanted to scream, to tell them all the truth about Neil's failures and Edna's manipulation, but I remained stoically silent, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing me break. Instead, I excused myself from the table and stepped outside, taking deep breaths to calm my racing heart. It was in that moment that I realized I couldn't continue to live this way. I had to leave, to find a way out of this toxic environment before it destroyed me completely. Later that evening, I found myself confiding in my daughter, Clara. She had always been my rock, my confidante, and I knew I could trust her with my deepest fears and doubts. As we sat together on the couch, I poured out my heart to her, telling her about the constant insults, the passive-aggressive behavior, and the suffocating control Edna had over our lives. Clara listened patiently, her eyes filled with concern and love. When I finished, she took my hand in hers and said, "Mom, you deserve so much better than this. You are a strong, talented, and amazing woman, and you don't need to put up with their abuse any longer." Her words hit me like a lightning bolt, and I felt a sudden surge of clarity wash over me. She was right. I had spent too many years silently enduring their mistreatment, and it was time for me to take a stand. I had to value myself, to recognize my own worth, and to prepare for a life without Neil and his toxic family. With Clara's encouragement ringing in my ears, I began to make plans. I started secretly searching for apartments, determined to find a place where I could start fresh and rebuild my life on my own terms. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I was ready to face the challenges head-on. As I lay in bed that night, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about the future. I knew that leaving Neil and his family would be painful, but I also knew that it was necessary. I had to prioritize my own well-being, to reclaim the respect and autonomy that had been stripped away from me for so long. With a newfound sense of purpose, I closed my eyes and drifted off to sleep, dreaming of a future where I was free from the chains of my past, ready to embrace the possibilities that lay ahead. With newfound determination, I began to put my plan into action. I started covertly searching for apartments, scouring online listings, and making discreet calls to potential landlords. I knew I had to be careful, as any hint of my intentions would surely be met with swift retribution from Edna and Neil. As I searched, I also began to discreetly pack my belongings. I started with small, inconspicuous items. A few books here, a piece of jewelry there. I tucked them away in hidden corners of the house, slowly building a secret stash of my most treasured possessions. But even as I worked towards my escape, the tension at home continued to escalate. Neil, ever the dutiful son, seemed to be under increasing pressure from his parents to maintain the illusion of his success. He began to siphon money from our joint accounts, claiming it was for shared expenses, but I knew better. I remember one particularly heated argument we had over finances. I had confronted him about the missing money, demanding to know where it had gone. He had the audacity to look me in the eye and lie, claiming it was for a business investment that would pay off tenfold. I saw right through his deceit, and I felt a surge of anger course through my veins. How dare he continue to manipulate and deceive me, even as I was planning my escape from this toxic environment? But I refused to let my anger consume me. Instead, I channeled it into a quiet, steely resolve. I would not let Neil or his family break me. I would regain the respect and autonomy that had been stripped away from me, no matter the cost. As the days turned into weeks, I continued to search for my new home in secret. I attended apartment viewings under the guise of running errands, always careful to cover my tracks. I knew that if Edna or Neil caught wind of my plans, they would stop at nothing to keep me under their control. Finally, after weeks of searching, I found the perfect place. It was a small, cozy apartment in a quiet neighborhood, far from the suffocating influence of my in-laws. I signed the lease with a sense of triumph, knowing that I was one step closer to my freedom. But even as I celebrated this small victory, I knew that the hardest part was yet to come. I had to find a way to leave without triggering a prolonged fight with Edna and Neil. I knew they would not let me go easily, and I had to be strategic in my departure. That's when fate seemed to intervene. Edna, in her never-ending quest to control every aspect of our lives, began to pressure me to sign the divorce papers once again. She cornered me one evening, thrusting the papers in my face and demanding that I end this farce of a marriage once and for all. In that moment, I saw my opportunity. I agreed to sign the papers, but on one condition, that I be allowed to leave immediately, without any further interference from her or Neil. Edna, so eager to be rid of me, readily agreed. And so, with a sense of both relief and trepidation, I signed my name on the dotted line. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, knowing that I was finally free from the legal bonds that had tied me to Neil and his family for so long. But even as I celebrated this small victory, I knew that the real challenge lay ahead. I had to gather my belongings and make my escape before Edna or Neil could change their minds. I had to be strong, to rely on the quiet strength that had sustained me through all these years of silent battles. With a deep breath, I began to pack my bags, ready to embark on the next chapter of my life. A chapter filled with uncertainty, yes, but also with the promise of a brighter future, free from the chains of my past. The day I moved into my new apartment was a day I will never forget. As I stepped over the threshold, a wave of relief washed over me, so powerful that it nearly brought me to my knees. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again, like the weight of the world had been lifted from my shoulders. I took a moment to simply stand there, taking in my new surroundings. The apartment was small, but it was mine. Every inch of it represented a new beginning, a chance to start over and rebuild my life on my own terms. As I began to unpack my belongings, I felt a newfound burst of creativity coursing through my veins. Ideas for new writing projects flooded my mind, and I found myself itching to sit down at my desk and put pen to paper. It was as if the act of leaving behind the toxic environment of my old life had unlocked something within me, something that had been dormant for far too long. Over the next few days, I threw myself into my work with a passion I hadn't felt in years. I wrote for hours on end, pouring my heart and soul into every word. I took breaks only to eat, sleep, and occasionally chat with my new neighbor, Grace, who had quickly become a source of support and friendship. Grace was a kind, empathetic woman who seemed to understand the struggles I was going through without me even having to say a word. She would often invite me over for tea and conversation, and I found myself opening up to her in ways I never had with anyone before. As I settled into my new life, I began to rediscover the joy of living independently. I relished the freedom to make my own choices, to come and go as I pleased without fear of judgment or criticism. I took long walks in the park, explored new cafes and bookstores, and even started attending a weekly writing group at the local library. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was truly living, rather than simply existing. I was no longer defined by my role as Neil's wife or Edna's punching bag. I was Naomi, a strong, capable woman with a bright future ahead of her. But even as I reveled in my newfound independence, I couldn't shake the feeling that the other shoe was about to drop. I had spent so many years living under the oppressive thumb of my in-laws that a part of me was still waiting for them to come barging back into my life, demanding that I return to my old ways. And then, 3 days into my fresh start, the phone rang. I picked it up, expecting it to be Clara, or perhaps a new client. But the voice on the other end of the line made my blood run cold. It was Neil, and he was in a panic. He spoke rapidly, his words tumbling over each other in a frantic jumble. From what I could gather, his family was in the midst of a financial crisis, and the carefully crafted facade of his success had come crashing down around them. I listened in stunned silence as he begged me to come back, to help him pick up the pieces of the life he had so carelessly shattered. But even as a part of me ached for the man I had once loved, I knew that I could never go back to that life. I had worked too hard, come too far, to let myself be dragged back into the darkness. With a heavy heart, I told Neil that I couldn't help him, that he needed to face the consequences of his actions on his own. And then, with a sense of finality, I hung up the phone, severing the last tie to my old life. As I sat there in the silence of my new apartment, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but I also knew that I had the strength within me to face whatever challenges lay ahead. I was ready to embrace my new life, to chase my dreams, and build a future filled with love, laughter, and endless possibility. The days following Neil's frantic phone call were a whirlwind of emotions. I tried to focus on my work, to lose myself in the joy of writing and the comfort of my new life, but his words kept echoing in my mind, refusing to be silenced. It wasn't until a week later that I learned the full extent of the crisis that had befallen my former family. Grace, my ever-vigilant neighbor, had heard through the grapevine that Neil's parents had lost everything. They had quit their jobs, believing in the fiction of their son's success, and now found themselves destitute and desperate. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy for them, despite all the pain they had caused me over the years. To have your entire world come crashing down around you, to realize that the life you had built was nothing more than a house of cards. I couldn't imagine the devastation they must have felt. But even as I grappled with these conflicting emotions, the phone calls from Neil continued. Each time, his voice grew more desperate, more unhinged. He begged me to come back, to help him pick up the pieces of the life he had so carelessly shattered. Naomi, they think I'm a successful writer, he pleaded, his voice cracking with emotion. They won't stop until you come back. I felt my resolve wavering, the old habits of a lifetime threatening to pull me back into the darkness. But then I remembered all the pain and humiliation I had endured at the hands of Neil and his family, all the years I had spent silently suffering under their oppressive rule. I won't be part of your lies anymore, I said firmly, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. You need to face the consequences of your actions. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, broken only by the sound of Neil's ragged breathing. And then, with a click, the call disconnected, leaving me alone with my thoughts once more. In the days that followed, I threw myself into my work with renewed vigor. I wrote like a woman possessed, pouring all of my pain and anger and hope onto the page. I attended writing workshops and networking events, determined to build a new life for myself, one that was entirely my own. And slowly but surely I began to heal. The wounds of the past would always be with me, but they no longer defined me. I was no longer Naomi the victim, Naomi the punching bag. I was Naomi the survivor, Naomi the thriver. But even as I embraced this new chapter of my life, I couldn't help but wonder about Neil and his family. What had become of them in the wake of their own destruction? Had they found a way to pick up the pieces, to start anew? It wasn't until months later that I learned the truth. Grace, ever the gossip, had heard through a friend of a friend that Neil and his parents had moved into a small, run-down apartment on the outskirts of town. They were barely scraping by, their once proud lives reduced to a shambles. I felt a strange sense of vindication at the news, a quiet satisfaction in knowing that they were finally facing the consequences of their actions. But even as I reveled in this small victory, I knew that I could never truly take pleasure in their downfall. For me, the true revenge was in living well, in building a life that was entirely my own. And so, with a sense of peace and purpose, I cut off all ties to my old life, embracing the freedom and independence that I had fought so hard to achieve. As I sat at my desk, surrounded by the trappings of my new life, I felt a sense of pride and accomplishment wash over me. I had confronted the demons of my past and emerged stronger, more resilient than ever before. And now, with the world at my feet and the future stretching out before me, I knew that anything was possible. As the months passed, I settled into my new life with a sense of peace and contentment that I hadn't felt in years. My writing flourished, and I found myself surrounded by a growing circle of friends and colleagues who appreciated me for who I was, rather than what I could do for them. But even as I reveled in my newfound freedom, I couldn't help but wonder about Neil and his family. What had become of them in the wake of their own destruction? Had they found a way to rebuild their lives, or were they still struggling to pick up the pieces? It wasn't until I ran into Grace at the local market that I finally got some answers. She pulled me aside, her eyes wide with a mix of excitement and disbelief. "You'll never guess what I heard," she whispered conspiratorially. "Apparently, Neil and his parents have moved into a tiny apartment on the other side of town. They're barely scraping by, and the whole neighborhood is talking about it." I felt a strange sense of vindication wash over me, a quiet satisfaction in knowing that they were finally facing the consequences of their actions. But even as I processed this news, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy for them. "I heard that Edna and Tom are constantly fighting," Grace continued, her voice lowering even further. "And Neil, well, let's just say he's not handling the pressure very well." I nodded, unsurprised by this revelation. Neil had always been weak-willed, easily swayed by the opinions of others. It was no wonder that he was struggling to cope with the weight of his own lies. Over the next few weeks, I found myself thinking more and more about my former family. I couldn't help but wonder what they were going through, how they were coping with the reality of their own downfall. But even as I grappled with these conflicting emotions, I knew that I couldn't let myself get pulled back into their toxic orbit. I had worked too hard, come too far to let them drag me back down into the darkness. And so, with a sense of resolve, I made a conscious decision to focus on my own future, to pour all of my energy into building the life that I had always dreamed of. I threw myself into my writing, attending workshops and conferences, networking with other professionals in my field. Slowly but surely, my hard work began to pay off. My freelance business took off, and I found myself inundated with new clients and projects. I even started to gain recognition in my field, with my work being featured in prominent publications and online forums. But even as I celebrated these successes, I never lost sight of the lessons I had learned from my past. I knew that true happiness and fulfillment came not from external validation, but from a deep sense of self-worth and purpose. And so I continued to focus on my own growth and development, both personally and professionally. I traveled, explored new hobbies and interests, and surrounded myself with people who lifted me up and supported my dreams. As the years passed, I found myself looking back on my journey with a sense of pride and accomplishment. I had faced some of the darkest moments of my life, but I had emerged stronger, more resilient than ever before. And while I knew that I would never forget the pain and betrayal of my past, I also knew that I had found a way to move forward, to build a life that was entirely my own. In the end, that was the true vindication, not in seeing Neil and his family suffer, but in knowing that I had triumphed over adversity, that I had found the strength and courage to create a future filled with love, laughter, and endless possibility. And as I looked out over the horizon, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, I would face them with the same resilience and determination that had brought me this far. For I was Naomi, a survivor, a thriver, and nothing could stop me now. As the years passed, I found myself reflecting more and more on the journey that had brought me to this point. It had been a long and difficult road, filled with pain and heartache, but also with moments of incredible joy and self-discovery. I thought back to those early days when I had first met Neil and fallen head over heels in love. We had been so young then, so full of hope and promise. I had truly believed that we would spend the rest of our lives together, building a future filled with love and laughter. But life had a way of throwing curveballs, and our marriage had slowly crumbled under the weight of Neil's lies and his family's toxic influence. I had spent years silently enduring their abuse, convinced that I was somehow to blame for their behavior. It wasn't until I found the strength to leave, to strike out on my own and build a new life, that I realized just how much I had been holding myself back. Freed from the chains of my past, I had flourished in ways I never thought possible. My writing career had taken off, and I found myself in demand as a freelance editor and consultant. I traveled the world, exploring new cultures and immersing myself in the beauty and diversity of life. But even as I celebrated these successes, I never lost sight of what truly mattered. My daughter, Clara, remained my rock, my constant source of love and support. And as she built her own family, I found myself cherishing every moment I could spend with her and my grandchildren. It was during one of these visits that I found myself reflecting on the true meaning of resilience. Clara and I were sitting in her backyard, watching her children play on the grass. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over everything, and I felt a sense of peace wash over me. "You know, Mom," Clara said softly, turning to me with a smile, "I've been thinking a lot about everything you've been through, and I just wanted to say how proud I am of you." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, and I reached out to take her hand in mine. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "But I couldn't have done it without you. You've been my strength, my guiding light through all of this." Clara squeezed my hand, her eyes shining with love and admiration. "You give me too much credit," she said with a laugh. "You're the one who had the courage to leave, to start over and build a new life. That takes a special kind of strength, Mom. A strength that I hope I can pass on to my own children." I nodded, feeling a sense of pride swell in my chest. Clara was right. I had faced some of the darkest moments of my life, but I had emerged stronger, more resilient than ever before. And that was a legacy worth passing on, a gift that I could give to my grandchildren and all the generations to come. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to twinkle in the sky, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I knew that there would be more challenges ahead, more obstacles to overcome. But I also knew that I had the strength within me to face them head-on, to keep moving forward no matter what life threw my way. And so as I sat there in the twilight, surrounded by the love and laughter of my family, I made a silent promise to myself. I would continue to live my life with resilience and self-worth, cherishing my autonomy and independence. I would be a role model for my grandchildren, showing them that it was never too late to start over, to build a life filled with purpose and meaning. For I was Naomi, a survivor, a thriver, and nothing could stop me now. I had conquered the trials of my past, and I was ready to embrace a future filled with endless possibility, anchored by the unshakable strength of my own resilience.